Hi, I'm John Cutterback.
And I'm Sofia Cutterback.
If you're wondering whether you can really be friends with your spouse
and raise children into responsible adults with whom you have a relationship,
and do what it takes to make a homestead, reconnecting with your body and the land wherever you live.
If you just want to think more about how to make a truly happy home in our trying times,
then The Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast, is for you. Join us. Welcome to this episode of The Intentional Household. This episode is optimizing the role of grandparents in children's lives. Well, I think I always say at the beginning I'm really excited about this episode, but thus far that's always been the case. And I'm particularly excited about this one as, well, you and I, DR, are in a kind of a unique position of we still have one child fully in the nest and one or two kind of with one bird leg still in the nest. And we're blessed to have one grandparent of their four still alive. And the whole experience of the grandparents' involvements in their life is very present to us. But now we're blessed to have 6 grandchildren of our own and very much experimenting and learning. So we can't say they were old hands by any stretch of the imagination. But we have a profound conviction of the importance of grandparents in the lives of children, especially today. And we'd like to look at this from both sides. And what I mean by both sides there is not from the children's side, but from the side of parents who are looking to get involved in their children's lives, those children's grandparents, and also look at this from the side of grandparents and how they can think about being more involved in their grandchildren's lives.
Great, super.
Does that sound like a reasonable approach? So I was thinking maybe we would begin by reflecting, first of all, just why, as I just suggested, today more than ever, grandparents are important in the lives of children. So if I said that to you, dear, if I just said, do you think that there's kind of a unique need, a unique call for this to be looked at? What would you say?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And it's connected to kind of how we all need to have a family to be a part of, because grandparents are, of course, part of a family. And so, it's one of these things that, again, is something that would have been taken for granted in previous generations. And now it's just like the household and the family. It's not something that we can just take for granted anymore. And the hidden blessing in that is that it really makes us, in seeking to be intentional, it helps us discover new beauty in the concepts in the relationship. So it's really, rather than just, hand-wringing and lamenting, we have to think about it more than previous generations, we get to think about it more. And it's really, as we've talked about it and thought about it, it's really been kind of a lovely discovery of what is the role that grandparents have in their grandchildren's lives and their children's lives. So
correct.
I'm excited about that.
That's a great way of putting it, dear. I like how, a theme that we think about a lot is the need to be intentional today. So many things in a prior generation you didn't have to worry about. You didn't have to be intentional about because they tended to be just kind of already in place.
Yeah.
This is another one of those situations in spades, really.
Yeah.
And it particularly struck me as you were saying that, the aspect of with the increased mobility, which is
Absolutely.
very much just a matter of the last couple generations that we now take for granted, that was simply by and large not the case, is there's that big question of kind of where are we going to live?
Yeah.
And you can't take it all for granted necessarily when two people get married, that they'll be living in physical proximity to either of the sets of parents, if they're blessed to have them still be alive. So that heightens already immediately the question of how we're gonna think about that, and how important is that as part of thinking about where we're going to live. And interestingly, we can talk about that from either side.
Yeah.
Where are we going to live, say, as we're retiring and older and being the grandparents? Where are we going to live when we're starting out our marriage? So let's definitely talk about that. But how about then just a little bit more on why do you think that children, in a sense, need their grandparents more than ever today?
I mean, yes. I mean, exactly the whole point of the experience of having a family unit is something that's so important in tethering people. And grandparents kind of fill that experience for a child to the next ring of the family circle. You know, we talk about the intentional household, how important it is to surround the children with the presence of the parents, something they can count on. To add the next layer, generational layer of a grandparent on the outside further kind of fleshes out and adds a kind of nuance and another facet to the child's experience as being part of a community. I think also it's important in the disembodied age that we live in that the persistent presence of someone, not just any person you're close to, but to someone who is generationally related to you, is actually an incredibly important experience for the child, because then they experience themselves as part of a physical continuity, not just a continuity of affection or social relationship. But that's something that, as we become more separated from the land, physical continuity is something that people don't really experience. And so I think experiencing it in the family relationship by the generations of a grandparent nearby is actually kind of profound in another way, other than just, oh, more people around me who love me. I think it actually gives us an experience of a physical connectedness that sometimes is, or very often is, threatened by our separation from the land.
And doesn't it seem that it's in divine providence, in a plan of nature, there is just something utterly unique, something that is hard to express conceptually, something that many of us have experienced at a very deep and visceral level of there's just nothing like grandparents. There's nothing like grandparents in your life. How do you put into words that unique relationship and that sense of belonging, that sense of security, that sense of having a deeper feeling of where you come from?
Yeah.
Is just it. It feels so important. It strikes us as this must be part of a gift. And again, it's not always going to be the case, right? And some people might never know their grandparents, but that would be pretty unusual not to know any of them. And by and large, it's fairly common, thank God, to have an experience of having a good number of years with at least a number of them.
Yeah. And I think we must be designed for that kind of relationship. I kind of interiorly chuckle as I think about our 12-year-old son right now is absolutely fascinated knowing his family tree from a perspective of, do I have German ancestors? Do I have Scottish ancestors? Oh, I have Scottish ancestors now. He has this great love for Scotland because it's part of his ancestry. And it's just so fascinating that he's saying, where do I come from? Where do I come from? Where do I come from? And that nearest ring to that question, where do I come from, is filled in particular and has a name in the grandparents.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting how we just seem to have this human desire to know, where do I come from? And it's a real experience there. Another reason I think it's the grandparent relationship is actually a very important thing to have in the context of the household is precisely because it is a relationship. It's a way of being. And so it's like the parent's relationship to the child is a way of being. The grandparent's relationship to that child is another way of being that's connected and yet different. And then for the child to also witness his parents having a relationship to their own parents, it's this kind of almost symphonic interaction of relationship. So the child to the grandparent, child witnessing his parents to their parents, the grandparents seeing their child in relationship to their own children.
Yeah.
So it's just it's very interesting because each of those relationships has its own particular dynamic. And you think, oh, well, I've always been a child to my parent. But when you become a parent to your own children, there's an added nuance to your relationship to your parents, that now your parents are your own children's grandparents. And so it's really an added layer of richness of relationship, nuance of difference there that just fills out and makes the picture more complete.
I like that. And it seems to me it feeds back in. There's always going to be a kind of primacy to your relationship to your parents. But the relationship to grandparents can very much deepen that particular relationship. And, and
Sure.
that's a real gift. And I just think back myself to a relationship I had with, say, in this case, my father's parents. I knew three of my grandparents, my father's parents and just my mother's mother. But to see my father interact with, have a relationship with his parents, have a relationship with them that I also have my own relationship.
Yeah.
It gives me a whole new kind of angle of insight into who my father is. You get to see your parent as a child, which helps you understand, you be able to relate to your parent more
Your own relationship to your parent.
as a
Sure.
child.
Yeah.
So as you say, I really appreciate there's so many angles of interconnected richness there, and perhaps we might just sum up the particular need today. And again, there's so many angles on it. Is we're in an age of disconnection,
Mm-hmm.
disconnection from our bodies, disconnection from place, disconnection from family,
Mm-hmm.
disconnection from our history, and more than ever, our lifestyles that you might say in many ways tend to be a bit suburban, and they're even if we're living in the country, kind of what I
Mm-hmm.
mean by suburban is not so much rooted in a place, generally much more mobile,
Mm-hmm.
and that just particularly in children, I think in a way that we might not notice, they wouldn't be able to articulate in words their need for the stability of connectedness to
Mm-hmm.
more people
Mm-hmm.
is really something huge that we, in this case, say as parents or as grandparents, can be aware of and intentional about. We're going to try to make this connection happen. So
Yeah.
really what I want to reflect upon here, we call it optimizing the role of grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
it is how can we step that up? How can we think more clearly and not just expect it to happen?
Yeah. Yeah. And as you often say, just asking that question is 50% of the way
There we
there.
go. All right. So we're 50%. Well, let's keep going.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then, how about if we start from the viewpoint of parents? Let's just say we're just starting out in marriage, and so we're blessed. We just have a child or a couple, young children, and perhaps we haven't given a whole lot of thought of this. Obviously, we tend to think, well, we want to be near our parents. But we can circle back to ask the question, well, what about where there's challenges where you don't particularly want to be near your parents?
Sure.
And that's certainly possible. And that is worth addressing itself. But often we want to be near our parents, and it's vaguely in our mind, well, wouldn't it be great? They'll be around our children. But let's really just narrow in from the start the presence and the importance and the beauty of the grandparents' involvement in our children's lives. What can we do as parents to facilitate that connection?
Mm-hmm.
Because I dare say, again, I think in prior generations where there already was that stability of place and homes and things that went on in their home was more intact, more, very, very often if the grandparents, the older generation wasn't right there in the house, they'd be right nearby.
Mm-hmm.
There tended to be the kind of activities that they already could share together. So there was more of a natural context where that connection is going to be made. Yeah. Those contexts aren't there.
Mm-hmm.
And so now very often it's going to be, okay, is someone driving to come over and making the time? Are we inviting someone over? How are we setting this up?
Sure.
We got to get kind of narrowed in on that. So it seems to me the first question, and I talk to a lot of young people about this, I want to bring this up here. Where are we going to live in this age almost of so many choices? Mm-hmm. A big question often for us when we get married is, where are we going to live? And it is the case now more than ever. The parents of each of us spouses might not be in the same area. Mm. So first of all, are we going to choose one, and we're going to choose the other? Mm-hmm. Or at times we're being offered a great position, a job, or going to school someplace where neither is. How important is it for us to prioritize, or at least enter that in as a question? Can we live near our parents, meaning our children's grandparents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And just even asking that question kind of presupposes an open mind to that being a possibility, which is important. I think very often young couples, when they get married and these opportunities are given to them, rightfully so, they're looking at one another saying, what's good for our family? What do we need to do for our family? And I think without sufficient awareness, especially at that point early on in your marriage, you don't feel the importance of the presence of a grandparent in the child's life. And so it's just great to be alerted that will be this upcoming dynamic of the grandparents involved with the children,
Right.
and to remember to weigh that in as one of the factors. Now, sometimes it's not something that you can ultimately base your decision on, and a decision is required to be made. That means you're not going to be living near your own parents, and the children won't be close to their grandparents. But even having asked that question makes you aware that you're going to try to bring the grandparents into your children's lives through whatever means you can, whether it's phone calls or stories about grandparents or talking about them. As long as the parents have an awareness of the need for a grandparent present in the child's life, then we begin to arrange our life differently. And I think that's a good thing.
Yep. No, absolutely. Now, all right. So if we start to make the mental list here, and there's different angles we have to look from because we want to say something. What if you end up in a situation where you're not living in close proximity to the grandparents, which is, I mean, if I just think about the many young families we know, I'd say a decent number are near grandparents, but then a good, decent number have chosen in these trying times to live in a community that they really think is going to be good for their children. But it so happens that where their parents live is not that kind of community.
Sure.
Pardon me. And so they prioritize, understandably and perhaps rightly, being in a certain kind of community where they can have friends of a certain kind, and that their children will be able to have friends, have support, maybe the kind of schooling, and their parents are back someplace else. So we certainly want to note here that where your parents are when you get married is only one factor. And it might be the case in your situation that you choose for the sake of a certain kind of job, a certain kind of community, that you're going to be far. But I think we should have just duly noted, give due consideration. Have we really thought that through and weighed that proximity to grandparents is significant when possible. And it's just one of those things that we're going to try to factor in. So for starters, we're going to do that much.
Yep. That's a great principle.
What if we just say, all right, now we're blessed to be in proximity and we want to take some steps to facilitate that connection? What are we going to do there? What steps are we going to take to say, all right, well, sure, we're living nearby, but what's supposed to happen next? As parents, I think young parents, we probably tend to think that, well, it's not really up to us. It's going to be up to the grandparents. They move on their schedule. They have their particular needs. We're not going to be demanding of them. We hope that they want to be involved. How do you think the new parents ought to think about that?
Well, I mean, again, I think thinking about it and knowing that it's an issue or a question is already the first part of the challenge being met, so to speak. I going into it, you just mentioned a couple of things that might intimidate a person or a parent from feeling like, oh, I'm going to overstep my bounds if I ask my parents to be more involved with their grandchildren. I think that that's a good thing to remember, that when you look at your parents who are now grandparents and asking them to be involved in your life, of course, recognizing and realizing that they have their own intact interior household that they will be oriented toward. And so this new kind of orientation toward their grandchildren and the secondary household is something that's new. And so it is a good thing to be respectful and aware and observant of that you're asking your parents to do something that is actually a new addition to their household. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time and flexibility and creativity, which makes me think that one of the things that we've mentioned so frequently in our other podcasts, whenever you inquire any kind of a challenge in your marriage, it's an opportunity for communication. And so I would say the first step is, wherever it's possible, to invite your parents into a conversation or a discussion about how can we involve you in our life. And then you're listening, right? Where are your restrictions? Where are your limitations? Your capacity, if the grandparents are young, the grandparents are doing many more physically oriented things. If the grandparents are older, they're much more limited in that regard Does that mean they're less involved with their grandchildren? Maybe it's just involved in a different way. So, those are all things that actually become apparent when we begin to have that conversation. And so
Right.
that's something I wanted to underscore. Spouses are always having an invitation to deepen a relationship through conversation. This is a next tier of a family relationship that is an invitation for you to enter into a deeper relationship through conversation, which is one of inviting and then listening to, well, what could you do? We want to share with you. It's very important to us that you're present in our children's lives. How can we make that happen?
Yeah.
That's kind of how I picture
Yeah.
being
I
initiated.
think that makes a lot of sense. I love your point of how that is an amazing, unique, natural opportunity, therefore providential opportunity, this to deepen our relationship with our parents. And that is such a serious, beautiful thing is precisely the kind of thing that can take a relationship to the next level. And I wonder how many people, how many of us miss that, that have we as young parents, have we reached out to our own parents and said, if nothing else, we just want you to know that we are so excited that you are our children's grandparents. We are so excited to have you be as big a part of their lives as possible. And we want to facilitate that in any way we can. We don't want to encroach upon your life, but we want to prioritize that.
Right.
Already that's going to go very far.
Yeah. I mean, that's huge. And that's a really beautiful way of inviting. And I think it's important. It makes me chuckle when I think about this. I mean, we have 6 grandchildren, that it's happened very quickly because 3 of our children got married not too far from each other. So it's kind of multiplied rapidly. But I just chuckle when I think to myself how not obvious some of these things were to me. And I feel like it's something newly learned. Of course, you're looking forward to your grandchildren. You're like, oh, I can't wait. We're just going to have this overflow of generosity, et cetera. But I didn't really think specifically about, well, how will I interact as grandmother here? Now, the obvious way is helping, right? We are still very actively parenting in our home. So my ability to help as grandmother is seriously limited by the fact that I'm still very much in the active role of running my own household and parenting myself. And so, when you're not able to help as much as you would like, or it seems super obvious, or all of a sudden you're really helping is a little bit more complicated than it is to say the sentence, oh, I'm there to help. It's just kind of funny how I remember myself as a mother looking toward my parents and your parents and just feeling like the obvious way for them to be a parent is to be helping, because helping is actually a way of being involved in the life of your children. And so that's kind of an obvious way. And I'm realizing now on the other side, being a grandparent, it's not that obvious because it's not always that straightforward to be the help that they need for a variety of practical reasons. And so it's kind of interesting to me to realize that, I need my children to say to me, we would love it if you could be involved in this way. It actually helps me out. Yeah. I'm a first-time grandparent. And this thing that seems so natural and obvious and normal, all of a sudden I realize, I'm not exactly sure how this takes shape in the practical realm. Right. So it's funny. I just really have this experience, which is kind of makes me chuckle. It's a little bit humbling where you go, wow, can you describe to me how you want me to be involved here? And yet it's very helpful. And so that's by way of encouragement to say to people, it's wonderful for you to be explicit, to invite your parents in, and to even give them explicit opportunities or explicit descriptions of this would be a great way for you to be with Johnny, or a great way for you to be with.
Right. But of course, someone might also say there, though, that the new parents don't know exactly what to do either. And so it is, but that casts us back on, hey, this is an opportunity to have a conversation and to grow together and have to figure this out together and be patient with one another and have to work it through. But it just struck me as you were speaking, help is a very obvious mode, but hopefully it's not the only mode. Yeah. I mean, there's just simply the mode of being together. And are we as parents inviting the grandparents over sometimes and just saying, just want you to come over and spend the evening, spend Sunday brunch, spend Sunday afternoon, can we stop in and visit you?
Mm-hmm.
Um, that it seems that's important, less to be reduced simply to a help,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, there's the help thing is going to be important. And in God's providence, I think, especially today, especially where mothers tend to be isolated and tend towards being overwhelmed,
Mm-hmm.
that's something that hopefully grandparents are going to get in the zone of asking themselves, how much can we give here?
Mm-hmm.
And again, later we're going to circle back to from the viewpoint of the grandparents, but or to just say this now, I hope the grandparents are going to be willing to say, this might just be something that we have to prioritize. I know we were thinking that
Yeah.
we're kind of done with certain
Yeah.
kinds of
Yeah.
things, but what exactly does done,
Yeah.
mean? And so,
Done having a relationship.
and so, an incredible gift that we might be in a position as grandparents to give, or staying for the moment from the viewpoint of the new parents, giving the grandparents an opportunity, without demanding it, to help, I think will be a big part of it. And I was going to throw out the very practical thing of, it sometimes, having a regular arrangement. This will depend on various circumstances, but a regular arrangement can be a particularly good one. I of course
Mm-hmm.
have to share that, when our older son, was young, Nicholas, we had the thing that we called Grandpa Day,
Mm-hmm.
which was on Wednesday, and my father would come and pick up Nicholas, or I'd take him over and drop him off, and they'd spend, they'd have lunch. Grandpa would make them lunch. They'd have lunch together, and they'd do whatever projects Grandpa was working on, and that was clearly a huge part
Yeah.
of our son's life,
Mm-hmm.
and that he would look forward to it in a very, very special way. And frankly, it's nice at times for parents just to know, going to not have to worry about perhaps, taking care of that child or finding something for that child to do.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there's Grandpa Day or Grandma Day for several children, but this neat aspect of sometimes, if you can, just taking one and doing so, maybe there's a rotation. These are the type of things we want to look at, but to the extent that they're practically possible, this can be life changing
Yeah.
and helpful in a very particular way.
Yeah, that puts me in mind of another reason I think it's important to have a grandparent relationship kind of in the regular contact of a child. Actually, this was something that Christopher Alexander points out in his book, A Pattern Language, when he talks about multi-generational living. And one of the merits he underscores in having a grandparent there, he said, the relationship of the parent and child is in a certain sense there's a certain kind of built-in friction of the child growing into a continual independence and the parent having to continually guide and direct. This is not a negative thing. And it's from a lot of times friction is the source of growth in all kinds of things in the natural world, et cetera. And so it is between parents. It's not a bad thing. The reality is it is a little bit of a pressure, a tension, or a friction that's really great if that valve can be released. And so he describes it. Grandparents are wonderful to have in the same house so that when the parent is having this disciplinary friction with the child turns away from that moment and steps into the grandparents' relationship where the grandparent's not responsible for giving that direction. And so there's just kind of a release of the pressure valve where it's simply not part of that relationship. This is not to say that the grandparents don't have a role of authority, et cetera, but the primary responsibility of that guidance is not on the grandparent child relationship in ordinary circumstances. And so I think that's really true. Just thinking about Nicholas having Grandpa Day, it was just going into an environment where he was getting all kinds of direction.
Yep.
That was part of his moral formation, his imagination, his appetites, his tastes. But his experience having it all happening in the grandpa environment was very different from his growing up doing things with his daddy formation. And I just think it's a beautiful gift to a child and a parent that there's somewhere that your child can go away from that and just open the release valve a little bit, and this calm kind of ensues.
I think it's a great point. But let's dig into that, because here's a little bit of maybe a fly in the ointment or something that does have to be worked through. And I've certainly heard people have different theories and practices on this. Discipline or authority in grandparents, you kind of hear everything from, although my sense is this probably tends to be the more common, in the direction of, hey, when they're with grandparents, they can kind of, they
Do anything.
get to do whatever they want, and grandparents spoil them. Surely there's a truth to along the lines you were just saying. There is kind of a release there. There's not that intrinsic tension because there's not that first responsibility to be forming them and calling them on things in the grandparents. But at the same time, I mean, this also can be a tricky one. I know some parents will say, I have a problem that my parents, the grandparents, don't particularly hold certain rules, and so the children come back a little bit freaked out. They've just been kind of bouncing off the wall. So how can we try to express how to think about what the ideal is? And of course, there'll be different forms that it takes, and different, it's not going to be exactly the same. But in principle, what are we looking for there? How are the grandparents? How should we think about the grandparents as still giving a certain order, that they're having a certain authority? What do you think?
Yeah, I just feel like it always comes back to that notion of relationship. So there are different roles, but it's like you're not just kind of abstractly a grandparent, or by some very kind of tenuous thread. Oh yeah, that's my child's grandchild. Okay, that makes me a grandparent. It's actually your role is in relation to your child, and your grandchildren are your children's children. And so, but your children are the primary director of the moral formation of your children, et cetera. So you see yourself as part of that role. So that's why this whole thing of grandparents that just completely don't support parents' approach to disciplining their children, or rules or restrictions or anything like that. Not that it has to be exactly done in the exact same mode with the grandparents. A grandparent should always see themselves as participating in the authority of the parent vis-a-vis the children. The grandparent doesn't actually have that direct authority. It doesn't mean he has no authority, but it's an authority through participation and relationship with the parent. And so it would seem to me, and I'm sure this is part of the reason why overindulged children who come home from their grandparents' house actually aren't super happy. I mean, in a certain sense, they're like, yeah, I got whatever I wanted, but their behavior belies that. They're not peaceful. They're not happy. It's actually doesn't foster their happiness, because the child themselves experiences there is a dichotomy between what my parents, who I have this primary relationship to, how they're growing me, and then when I go to my grandparents, it's essentially like my grandparents are saying, don't worry about that. That's not important. And that creates a friction in the child's life where he immediately kind of realizes something's not right here.
Right.
And so I just think it's beautiful for us to remember, once again, kind of the philosophical approach is, what's the principle involved here? The grandparent is related to the child through the parent. And because you're related through the parent, what you do with the child has to somehow bear the mark of what the parent is doing. It's not just an independent action. So I don't know. It just seems like that would be a good a good principle of approach.
I like it.
What's my interaction with my grandchildren is going to be a participation in the work that my children are doing with their children.
Would it be fair then to say, perhaps, that the ideal is that there is a kind of release, as you were referring to earlier, of this certain wider breathing, you might say, when children are with the grandparents, and not as though parents are oppressive and they needed to get away from it, but there's just kind of a natural aspect of just that there is something nice about that, and almost like a little bit of letting the hair down, but at the same time, how beautiful and fitting it is if the grandparents are fundamentally supporting, backing up, reaffirming, in their own way. I mean, a little bit of, you could say, maybe this isn't a perfect way of putting it, but a little bit of a good cop, bad cop, or over here saying, it's almost like the child could complain to the grandparent, gosh, it was so hard, mommy and daddy demanded this of me. Well, okay, the grandparent is an opportunity to kind of explain, maybe in a little bit more removed, gentle, but very effective way. And here, for grandparents to be intentional about this. Obviously, this is something that is a subject for a great conversation between the grandparents and the parents. Yeah. And it might be the case that either one might end up bringing it up. But in this case, again, right now, we're still thinking through the view of the parents of the young children. They might just say to their grandparents, just to be clear, we want you to know that, we have certain things that we expect of the children,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of here's what they are. We would expect that they would, act these ways and not these ways when they are with you.
Mm-hmm.
And we would love it if you kind of back us up on those things. And obviously, we're not going to ask you to discipline or punish them, but that you are going to have certain standards
Mm-hmm.
in your interaction with them. And you might need to invoke our authority, the parents of the children might kind of invoke our authority, or you be in a position to remind them of certain things that we, the parents, ask of our children.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the type of thing that can be that fruitful communication where we've actually shared those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no also mutual mystification where the parents of the small children are wondering, well, gosh, why are the grandparents, why are our parents, the grandparents, doing this or not doing that? Let's talk about that, and talk about how in this great and demanding project of forming children, they're part of it with us.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of a line from St. Thomas Aquinas, who said, raising your children is a lifelong project.
Mm.
And the more I think about that, surely part of what he had in mind is, in a sense, you're still doing an aspect of the raising of your children by participating in their parenting.
Mm-hmm.
You're still, because raising children is always about helping them grow into their true selves.
Mm-hmm.
You as grandparents, of course, can mentor your children, and in how you relate to the grandchildren, that's part of how you continue to love and give to, and in some sense, form your own children.
Yeah. And I think that underscores also St. Thomas's point there, underscores that being a lifelong endeavor, that you're always open to learning what the new way of interacting with your child is. So when your child is 2, obviously the interaction is very different than when they're 14 or 15. The interaction with your child who is now a parent becomes different. First of all, their needs from you are different. Their autonomy is different. So we're always needing to learn anew, what is this new relationship demanding of me? And so I think it's constantly asking to be reevaluated. And again, the conversation helps clarify that.
Yep. What if we move to, before we turn to kind of the grandparents' perspective, which we can in a moment, if the grandparents are remote,
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's worth saying this will have to be worked out in different practical ways. But to think about how do you have the grandparents be involved in your children's lives when they are physically remote?
Mm-hmm.
The things that immediately come to my mind are, we speak of the grandparents, and we speak of them with respect.
Mm-hmm.
We share their story. So our kind of presenting the grandparents to the children, this is actually whether they live nearby or not, but especially when they're not there themselves,
Mm-hmm.
we kind of have them in our heart, and we bring them to the children.
Mm-hmm.
Another obvious thing is taking that opportunity to make the phone call.
Sure.
And really kind of make that happen. That's going to, it's hard. We're busy. But of all the things to kind of make sure happens, just seems to me that that's one, finally, and you tell me if anything else strikes you, to look seriously at making the trip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And is that Christmas trip, is that summer trip that maybe is inconvenient? I know some people are going to raise reasonably, well, look, at what point do we start to just need to more focus on having like the holidays, these holy days in our own home?
Mm-hmm.
Very reasonable. And I think in a divine providence, it's easier to take that passel of children when they're quite young and go to grandma and grandpa's. And that might not be so much possible as they get a little older, and we really want to kind of focus on the life we're having here in the home. And maybe that's where we turn around and ask, what can we do to facilitate grandma and grandpa coming to visit us? And these are all just practical things. But to be in that zone and to not let the time pass without really thinking about these things before it's too late.
Yeah. And I would add another practical thing that could be done if the grandparents are remote is taking the time and making the effort to describe to the grandparents each of your children. So obviously your parents know that you have these children and what their names are and what their general ages are. But it's to kind of overcome what would have been happening had they been there in person. Your parent is observing your child and getting to know them in the details. That's something, if your parent doesn't have the opportunity to be physically close to your children, you kind of have to make up that difference by remembering to tell them the details.
Yeah.
Oh, so-and-so really loves music. They're very tenderhearted. They're a sensitive person, or this person seems to love this child loves dogs. He just, those are small details which seem like nothing. And yet those are the details that are the way you get to know a person. And so it becomes an extra burden on the part of the parent that really makes a huge difference for the grandparent to be able to connect with the grandchild they don't live with if these details are provided.
Yeah, I love it. Well, let's just take a look from the side of, all right, grandparents. What thoughts do we have for the grandparents? Again, they could be facing, we've given a lot of context or scenarios here that I think kind of imply already some things from that side. But
Sure.
let's just run the drill. First of all, again, being very intentional and recognizing it might be a question of where we live. And what are our priorities? And I don't want to push too hard on this. I don't want to overdo it. But I think particularly in our age where there's this slightly romanticized, probably overdone aspect of, well, the golden years of retirement where now I get to do what I want to do.
Child free.
Is there something to go? Well, I mean, there's golden years and there's golden years. We have to ask some real questions. What makes them be golden?
Sure. Yeah.
And are we really thinking clearly about the astounding gift, the call, even a kind of duty that needs to be discerned, to be involved in our grandparents, part of my grandchildren's now life? And some of us might be thinking, "Oh, that's great. I mean, I'm loving it. I love grandchildren. I'm really looking forward to being involved in their lives. I really love already being, and that's wonderful. That's a gift. But it's certainly not going to be all sunshine. And to be ready, I mean, we've already found that ourselves that, gosh, it is such a gift. We do enjoy it so much, but there have been times where we have had to make some decisions where, in view of our prioritizing this for the sake of our children and for the sake of our grandchildren, that we were going to set aside certain other things we would have wanted to do because of just how this is worth a special effort right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would add to that, like it's a little bit even going back a step, is just remembering that since this is part of the design, it's part of the design that people have grandparents or that you become a grandparent. It's part of the design. The design is always for the good of all those that are within the design. So, you think to yourself, been there, done that. I need my vacation. I'm going to go, live in Florida or whatever, something like that. The reality is this new transition to you being a grandparent is actually a gift to you. There's something in you that can only be actuated through this new relationship.
That's great.
And so if you are running away from quote unquote the work, which frankly, I have to confess, being a mother who is still parenting and newly stepping into the role of grandparent, of course, I'm so delighted to have these grandchildren. They're absolutely marvelous. And I think maybe you and I had a little bit of a different practical approach when it came to it, because I'm still kind of worn out from doing the parenting thing. Whereas you're a little bit in a different position and just so ready to just open doors all the time. Anything is great. And I have a little bit more of a natural reaction of, I actually can't. I understand that instinct of a little bit protectiveness, or even the work being overwhelmed by this new addition of work. If we can remember that the relationship is always growing something in us. It's not just like, oh, it's going to make you a better person. There's actually an aspect of you that's part of the design that can really only be actuated through being a grandparent.
That's great. That's a great point. Thinking of the aspect of, particularly from a grandma's viewpoint, babcia, as the case may be.
That's the Ukrainian for grandmother is babcia.
That We know one dear woman who is, I know, a wonderful grandmother. And she shared with us, she's blessed to have children with their children live nearby.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe she had said something to the effect of, look, let's set some parameters here. I'm not going to do your babysitting. There's just kind of I have too much, there's too many of the grandchildren. Just like every time that one of you needs a babysitter, you can't just come and say, Mom, will you do the babysitter sitting? So by and large, I'm going to ask you to plan on getting a babysitter. And there's still going to be all these other ways that I want to be involved in my grandchildren's lives, but not fundamentally by simply being the babysitter.
Yeah, and the distinction being made, she said, if you have a doctor's appointment or emergency, of course I will always be there for you. But from the perspective of, there are many other times you need childcare, casual childcare needs, going out on a date with your husband, and that are important. But for those, just set up a regular babysitter, which I think this was quite a few years before we started parenting that she said this. Grandparenting, excuse me. And I just really appreciate it. There was just nothing about this woman that was in the slightest bit stingy about giving herself to her children and her grandchildren. Yet she was able to say, these are my needs and my limits. And I think that I can serve you best when we have a mutual understanding of what my limits are. And it allows me to give more generously if we have a mutual understanding of what my limits are. So it was just such a great witness to me of how saying no is not unloving. So it's not necessarily a sign of being ungenerous. And I think that's important, because you're melding together two families when you're talking about parents and grandparents. They're two households.
Right.
And in order for any kind of successful melding of two households, it's really helpful to have explicit boundaries.
Well, this goes to a good point there of how maybe thinking about household, a great way the grandparents can serve their children and grandchildren is by continuing to be intentional about their own household, even when it's an empty nest. And this beautiful empty nest now, in many ways, is newly capable of being a nest in a different way.
Absolutely.
And it takes so their own household isn't dissolved. And I almost, in one way that you might say, is what this friend of ours was kind of signaling there, that was just a prudent way. And different people with different ways. If she has a number of grandchildren, if there are only one or two grandchildren, it might well have been the case that grandma would have just said, you ever need a babysitter, I'm happy. And that's fine. There's certainly nothing wrong with being your grandchildren's regular babysitter. But it's just, again, it's a matter of the principle of, we do have to respect where one another are, even while being generous. And let's look at how can we optimize, how can we maximize, how can we do this in the best way of not wearing one another out, but having the kind of quality contact and offering a certain kind of help. But just this beautiful aspect of from the grandparent perspective, here's new reason to be intentional about your home and making your home be a place of good work and of true leisure, to be able to invite your children and grandchildren back into something beautiful. Is it when they come and stay for a week with you over summer? Is it that they're down the road, and when they come over, they're invited into what's going on here? They have to learn that we're always going to have open heart, open hands, open home, but you're going to have to respect what's going on here and enter into it. And we're going to try to make it be as amenable to you as possible.
Yeah.
I have to say, I am looking forward to that. There's certain projects that I'm thinking I want to make be part of my household again, which I haven't done since the children were young, that I want to have be going on here in our home to welcome our grandchildren when they are here into it. And it's just a whole new kind of breathes this new life into, okay, all the more ways that our household can be a beacon, can be a place of rest, a place of joy, for
I
those
can't
that we love most.
I can't help but the image you're drawing of an intentional, intact household that the grandchildren come into. It's a little bit like the land of Spare from Narnia. I remember as a child going to my grandparents' house because it wasn't mine, but yet it was such an intact household of my grandmother and my grandfather's life together that it had this magic of being this other world that's at the same time connected, just like the land of Spare was connected, but yet completely different and magical. So it just provides that
Yeah,
lovely
yeah,
opportunity. I mean,
yeah,
I just
yeah,
remember
yeah.
as a young child, especially, and then as your children age, the grandchildren age, it is a beautiful kind of formation or education for them of going into, if the household isn't intentional and they do whatever they want whenever they get there, it's basically your grandparents' home just becomes an extension of your own desires, or it's where you get what you want. Whereas a grandchild going into an intact household, automatically what that means is there are boundaries, rules, and restrictions that actually give shape to this special land of Spare that you have to kind of live by. And that's such a beautiful lesson of living in a broader community of respect and deference and understanding that different is not necessarily exclusive. There's a way of entering into a place, but with the same time allowing it to be different from yourself.
Right. Well, tell me this. Do you think that is it unfitting for grandparents to have a little bit of an attitude of, here's an opportunity to try again? Here's a little bit of an opportunity for 2.0. It's not parenting 2.0 because it's not technically parenting, although it is a kind of extension of parenting. We learn certain things that we would have done better or we wish we could have done with our children, ways of interacting with children. Do you think that in God's providence, it's kind of an opportunity for grandparents to do again and do in a slightly different way and do in a better way to enact lessons that they've learned in their parenting?
I actually don't like putting it that way because it really runs the danger of it becoming a project that's about you. Oh, I get my second chance to like redeem my bad parenting choices. And people should never become part of a project. And so I think
Okay.
it's really important. This doesn't mean that you're not going to get an opportunity to do some of those things better. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a nuanced approach of your attitude, right? Like
Right.
if you kind of go, oh, this is my chance to correct things, chances are pretty good that you're going to start doing things for the children that will end up conflicting with what the parents are doing with them because it's about you now. It's not about supporting the parents of your grandchildren. And so I think
Okay.
it's important to not see it as a redeeming moment. And I think it's very much of an experience of you are a much wiser person. In a certain sense, you would be a much better parent where you are. And it's your opportunity to exercise that wisdom, but not as a way of redeeming the past, but enriching the present.
Wow. I think I just learned something important. I have to admit, when I expressed it that way, I said, "Well, what do you think of that?" I thought you were going to say, "Yeah, that sounds good,"
Sorry about
and
that,
then you just
sweetheart.
kind of went whap.
Yeah, and yeah, it's all recorded
Well, this
too.
is classic. I mean, classic. You know, I have a tendency, some other people might too, of making it be about me. Yeah, I'm going to just do it better this time. I know I'm not a parent again, but still, I'm going to kind of redeem. And you just kind of, while I think you're going to grant there's some
Yeah,
truth
of
there,
course.
obviously, of learning from the past, you did come in with the very important undercut of no, parenting is never about us, and grandparenting, a fortiori, is not about us. It's not what we feel about. It's not about making us feel better about making up for obviously, it will be beautifully fulfilling. But it's just yet another opportunity to grow in unselfishness of looking to the good of the other. Yes, learning from the past, but grandparenting is not parenting. It's its own thing. And just as through all the years of parenting, it's a continual effort. And Lord, help me understand what this amazing challenge is that you've given me for their sake. Same thing with grandparenting. It's big, not to be underestimated. It will demand a lot from us because it has a lot to give. It's not just as easy as, oh, great, well, this will be really fun. We get to have this neat interaction, someone who's going to
And plus
like
it
us.
is. It is that too.
And it is fun. But I just,
Yeah.
relationship grows according to how well and seriously we cultivate it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be the same thing with our grandchildren. I think a grandchild will feel if she is really just kind of a toy, a kind of
a project.
hey, it's just that it's fun, or interesting, diverting for grandma and grandpa. What a different feel when you feel that grandma, that grandpa kind of locks in and really has a sense of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And wants, without intruding, wants so badly to be there for me because I'm just precious to them.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that will take effort, and will take character, and will take prayer
and renewed effort. I think it's important. We shouldn't think that this is the attitude I have fundamentally toward my grandchildren, and that's a one and done. It is the fundamental attitude that we have toward our grandchildren. And we have to exercise constantly reminding ourselves as we continue and in repeated encounters, this is what I'm doing for my grandchild. This is what I'm doing for my grandchild. It's not that we have to always be self-conscious, but I do think that principles or the ideals are something that continue to enrich us and grow us if we exercise frequent recollection of those principles.
Yeah.
We always have to keep.
No, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Before we finish, I actually want to just raise the question: what does a young couple do, or not young couple, either way? And obviously, we could ask the same question for grandparents. What do you do when your parents are very much not on the same page? In some way, the way they choose to live their life and organize their household is antithetical to what you are doing with your children. Very often, that's the case. How do you, and even sometimes the situation can be serious enough where it's actually for the good of the children to not have constant or frequent physical interaction with a grandparent, because the grandparent might have habits that are deforming of the children or undermined in a very bad, serious way.
Right.
And let's just stop there, because actually it's a little bit. Let's talk about that first, and then we can talk about it when you have a similar situation from the grandparents' perspective, because I think it's a little bit different going the other way. What would you say about that?
I don't think we're going to be able to sort that all out, but maybe just a quick principle or two. I mean, I just, the thing that first strikes me is the foundation always of respect.
Yeah,
absolutely. Honor your father, your mother, and which kind of includes honor your grandparents. And of course, we, the children of the grandparents, are always going to honor them, and will never speak badly of them or speak uncharitably of them. We might end up in an age-appropriate way with our children, sharing with them certain things. Well, grandma and grandpa aren't, thinking the same way as we are about these things. It might have to be laid out.
That's not contrary to respect if it's done with a spirit of respect.
In the truth, that might have to, because there is a kind of primacy of what is right for the children. So it's a balance. And what's right for the children is always to respect their grandparents, but part of respect is not, for instance, following them where they shouldn't go, or subjecting themselves to things that are going to be hurtful. And I mean, absolutely, there can. This was just, I was going to say, God forbid, but sometimes it just is the case. It's part of the plan, and it's going to be part of the story, and it's going to be okay by God's grace, and it's going to be something that we're going to work through, and maybe draw us together as spouses, and maybe ultimately draw us together with our parents. But that we're going to have to navigate certain things there where we're protecting our children from their own grandparents. That might be part of parenting, and we have to understand that.
Yeah. And certainly a way that you keep the grandparents still there is the respect that you show them, even in having to educate your children why they can't be with them, or why the relationship isn't what it would ideally be.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a
And
great way of putting that.
and
That's
from
awesome.
the other side, I mean, grandparents can't override the wayward parents,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's the parents' responsibility towards their children. So if grandparents are looking at children who are
Mm-hmm.
failing in their responsibility to their grandchildren, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind there, and this is not a throwaway, this is real. It really is prayer. And it's important that we recognize that at times there's certain things where there's not much else. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that prayer is, oh, well, gosh, I can't do anything but pray.
Yeah. Or
Prayer
last ditch effort. We're praying all the time.
is serious,
Yeah.
and it is going to make a difference. And earnest prayer there is a way of staying engaged, and we're always going to be looking for the opportunity of, can we speak into it with our children, namely the parents of the grandchildren. And it might be a whole length of time where we can't, and that's just the situation. And we can't try to act extra vires. We can't go outside our powers.
That's super important.
But we're looking. It's not like we're going to walk in and say, "You can't do that to my grandchildren."
Yeah.
You know, what's that supposed to mean, right?
Yeah, of course, in a certain circumstance, even that might be required. But I'm just remembering earlier in our conversation the description of grandparents having an intact household. An alive household, that alone, even if you can't say anything, to welcome a grandchild into your home where there is this kind of integrity of home life, is a way of giving positive formation in a situation where you don't have any other authority or recourse to speak into something explicitly. Just the witness and the incredible power of an intact household, of kind of cocooning and pouring out affirmation and safety to any person. A grandchild feels that certainly when they come into that environment, and that might be one of the most profound and effective ways of speaking into and participating in a formation for the good.
Yeah, it might not even be. They might come back to that after they leave the home.
Yes,
I mean,
much later.
Who knows?
Yeah,
but I mean that's
really great. It makes me just really that image that you drew. It just makes me realize, yes, this is why the work of the household is never done. Often when people say household, they automatically think it's about raising little kids. It's about raising little kids. Right. And there are many people who come to our LifeCraft day, or, you know, when you lecture, who say, oh, well, we're done. We're grandparents now. You know, how does all this, or, oh, I'll have to tell my children about it. We're grandparents now. This doesn't really apply. But no, you never stop being a household.
Right.
And it's important for life to be dynamic in the household. And the Lord has designed it that the household continues to bear fruit in many unlooked for and surprising ways, right?
Indeed. And once you're a parent, you're always a parent, even if in the form that takes a different role of being a grandparent. And of course, you'll always be a grandparent. And it's just what an incredible gift to leave with those little ones that they can take with them wherever they go. And do we need to remind ourselves? We know this from our own experience. It will stay with you wherever you go. I mean, the small things that we do to try to be that grandpa, that grandma, let's do all that we can to give that gift. And if we're talking again about the parents, to try to help set up the situation where the grandparents can give that gift to their children. What an astounding part of a plan that we always discover to be better than we realized.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Well, great to have an opportunity to talk about grandparenting. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in this episode of The Intentional Household. If you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and leave a rating or review. If you have any topic requests, please send them to lifecraftgroup@gmail.com. For our Wednesday reflections, free courses, reading groups, and live events, please visit life-craft.org.